Hi there, Miss DePoy here, reading the Egypt game, the last chapter, 23 Christmas Keys. On the morning of Christmas Eve, Caroline had a telephone call from the professor, and afterwards she asked April to phone all the members of the Egypt gang and ask them to come to the halls for just a few minutes that night after dinner. The professor wants to see you, she said. He said he knows you'll all want to be with your families tonight and he won't keep you long, but he wants to see all 6 of you for just a few minutes. What for? April asked. I think he wants it to be a surprise, Caroline said. So April called up all the other Egyptians and made the invitation sound just as mysterious and intriguing as she could. Personally, she had a suspicion that the professor was just going to give back all their stuff. But as Toby said, there's nothing like keeping things livened up. After dinner, Caroline made some hot spice cider and April arranged a plate of fancy Christmas cookies that she and Caroline had baked. Just about then, the guests started to arrive. Ken and Toby came first, looking slightly embarrassed to be visiting where a girl lived. Then Melanie arrived with Marshall, and Elizabeth came a few minutes afterwards. They sat around for a while, drinking cider and listening to a Christmas carol program. They speculated about what the professor had in mind, and had just about agreed that he was probably bringing back all their stuff when he arrived, apparently empty-handed. So that was the end of that theory. The professor gave April his coat and said hello to everyone in his strange, formal way. Caroline got everyone seated again and turned the music down very low. But for a while, they all just sat there feeling uncomfortable. The whole situation was so unreal that nobody knew quite how to act. At last, the professor put down his cup, looked around the room, and said, I've come to tell you a story. Out of the corner of her eye, April saw Ken and Toby exchange raised eyebrows. She narrowed her eyes and nailed them both with her fiercest glare. When somebody saves your life, it makes him sort of your property, and nobody was going to make fun of the professor with April around, even if he was going to treat them as if they were little kids. A Christmas story? Marshall asked. No, the professor began, but then he paused. Yes, he said, I suppose it is. I suppose it is a Christmas story in a way, but it's a sad story, a terrible story. Too terrible for children, perhaps. And yet, I feel that it's something the 6 of you ought to know. April felt, rather than saw, Ken and Toby prick up their ears. She gave an internal nod of approval. He had them now. The professor was doing all right. The story begins when I was a young man. I was really a professor then, at the university. I was always a very quiet and reserved person, and at that time my life, even my work, was beginning to seem rather dull and routine. But then one day a young woman enrolled in one of my classes and changed my entire way of life. Her name was Anne. April and Melanie looked at each other and their eyes made extravagant comments. Anne was an artist, the professor went on. My subject was anthropology, which, as you may know, is the study of all the various kinds and conditions of mankind. Anne was not particularly interested in anthropology, but she enrolled in a class I was teaching on primitive and ancient peoples because of her interest in primitive art. Anne used to tease me about anthropology. She said anthropologists were only interested in people in general, and she liked people in particular. And she did, too. All kinds of people. She was at ease with everyone, light-hearted, fun-loving, enthusiastic, and optimistic. There was a hopefulness about her. Well, after we were married, I began to see life in a new way. Anne was delighted when I decided to travel and do research. While I studied various tribes, she studied their art forms and collected samples of their crafts. And usually she managed to get involved in various efforts to improve the living conditions of the people of the area. The A to Z store was Anne's idea in the beginning. Her plan was to make it an outlet for some of the native handicrafts from areas where we had worked. It was on our last visit home together that she bought the building and made the first arrangements. The professor paused as if he was trying to think what to say next. On our last trip, he went on at last, Anne was visiting a mission where she was trying to set up a production center for native handicrafts. The people of the area were very poor, and she thought it would provide them with a means of earning a better living. There had been some unrest in the province, but we thought, well, there was an uprising, a small local rebellion. The mission was attacked, and Anne was killed by the very people she was trying to help. I came back here. I had no desire to teach, So I sold our house and moved into Ann's store. I had some idea of opening the store and operating it along the lines that Ann had planned, but I soon gave it up. I gradually broke off many of the contacts that Ann had made and let the store become a junk shop. I had a small income, so I didn't have to make the business pay, but for some reason, I kept the store open. As the years went by, the store and I became dusty junkyards, and after a while, I didn't care. The professor looked up and around the circle of intent faces, and his lips moved in their slight smile. And then one day, he said, I heard a strange noise in my storage yard. At first, I told myself I was watching to make sure nothing was damaged and no fires were started. You know, sacred fires can be just as dangerous as ordinary ones. Then, after the murder, when my business dropped to almost nothing and I had little else to do, I watched more and more often. You mean you watched us do the ceremony for the dead and the oracle and all that stuff? April asked. Yes, all of that. The Egyptians exchanged sheepish glances, and Ken hit himself in the forehead in an agony of embarrassment. Sheesh, he moaned. The oracle, Toby said suddenly. Hey, you didn't have anything to do with... The professor nodded. I'm afraid I must plead guilty to that. I watched you leave that night, and I saw the octopus left behind in the rain. I went out and pried open the old padlock and went into the yard. The wind was blowing the rain into the shed quite badly, and under the altar covering seemed the driest place. I was getting wet and was in such a hurry that I didn't stop to consider that it might be hard to find. Then, as I was watching the next day, I suddenly conceived of a plan to direct you to the lost article by way of... He paused, and his lips moved again in his small, stiff smile. The oracle. What I did then, in behalf of security, was done on the spur of the moment. And afterwards, I tried not to think about it. I think I decided to play the part of the oracle because I felt obliged to let you know what I had done with security. And the oracle offered a way to do it without any direct contact. And direct involvement was what I had spent years eliminating entirely from my life. I had begun to suspect, however, that one of you, the professor looked at Marshall, knew that I was watching, but he was very careful in the way he watched back. I wasn't entirely sure until the night of the attempt on April's life. I was reading when I heard a sound in the storage yard, and of course I went immediately to the window. When I realized what was happening, my first reaction was the natural one. I grabbed up a block of wood, but then 25 years of self-imprisonment took control. I couldn't bring myself to break the glass and call. I stood there holding the block of wood in my hand, and then Marshall turned around and looked at me. I could see that he knew that I was there, and he was asking me to help. And then I broke the glass. The professor's voice stopped, and everyone waited until, at last, it became clear that his story was over, even though it hadn't sounded like an ending at all. For a long time, no one moved or talked. The room was very still, except for a boys' choir singing "Hark the Herald Angels" very softly on the radio. But then Marshall leaned over and poked Melanie. "Is that the end?" he whispered loudly. "Shh," Melanie said and nodded. "But what about the Christmas part?" Marshall whispered even more loudly. The professor must have heard Marshall, but he didn't answer. Instead, he began to feel around in his jacket pocket. There was a jingling sound, and he brought out a handful of shiny new keys. The keys had long chains to wear around your neck, and on the head part of each one, a name was engraved. The professor read all the names one by one and handed out the keys. Elizabeth, Toby, Melanie. Is it to Egypt?" Elizabeth whispered as she took her key and looked at the professor's nod there was a storm of comment. "Hey, neat, awesome, thanks a lot, yeah, thanks a lot." "Of course, you'll have to enter on the other side of the yard now," the professor said. "I've had a new padlock put on the door, a padlock with just 6 keys. Caroline got up and went to the kitchen for a fresh round of cider and cookies, but everyone was too busy talking and planning to be much interested in food. "No, not tomorrow," Melanie said. "Tomorrow's Christmas, and we'll have to be home most of the time. But the next day..." "Yeah," Toby agreed. "We'll be doing the togetherness bit at our pad tomorrow, too. My dad's even promised to stay out of his studio all day. But the day after's okay by me." So the date was made. Egypt, the day after Christmas, right after lunch. Then everybody got up and started getting ready to go home. At the door, Ken turned back. Professor, he said, are you still going to watch us all the time? Everybody laughed. No, I'm afraid I won't have time, the professor said. I seem to have gotten myself involved in being a real storekeeper. I'm going to try to do some importing again, handicrafts and curios. I'll be doing quite a bit of traveling for a while until I get my stock lined up. But perhaps, once in a while I'm home, you'll invite me to a special occasion? Sure, Toby said. That'll be great. Thanks again for the great present. Sure wish we had something for you. Yes, some of the others chimed in. We should have brought something for you. The professor held up his hand. But I thought you understood, he said. You've already made me a gift, a very important one. He smiled his strange, solemn smile and put his hand on Marshall's head. That's how I should have ended my story, if I could have explained it with your gift to me. That would have been the Christmas part. That's what makes it a Christmas story. Late the next afternoon, April and Melanie lay across April's bed and chattered. They were stuffed to contented laziness with Christmas dinner and had been down to Melanie's apartment to look at her presents and then up to look at April's. They had talked about Christmas and presents until the subject was exhausted. And then they began to talk about the keys and the professor and what he'd said the evening before. Then, just lay there for a while. They dreamed and digested, and then Melanie suddenly sat up. I feel sad, she said. April made a why expression. Oh, I don't know, Melanie said. It's about Egypt. Going back and everything, it seems like it won't be the same. Yeah, April said. I thought about that too. We'll go back thinking it will be so terrific. And what will we do? The same things all over again? We've done just about everything exciting about Egypt. Yeah, and it's just awful when you go back to something that was so great, the way you remembered it, and it's no good anymore. It even ruins remembering. Melanie nodded tragically, and they both collapsed again. They lay there, staring into the future gloomily for a while, their chins on their hands. Then April turned towards Melanie, slowly and thoughtfully. Melanie, she said, what do you know about gypsies? And that is the end of the Egypt game. I hope you enjoyed reading it with me.